Here's a fact worth knowing. Not every organization faces identical DPDP obligations. A small local bakeries app and a nationwide fintech platform processing millions of transactions daily are held to very different standards under this act. That difference has a name, significant data fiduciary status, and it can dramatically increase your compliance burden overnight. In this chapter, we're unpacking exactly what makes an organization significant under DPDP, how that classification actually happens, and the additional obligations that kick in once you cross that threshold, appointing a data protection officer, undergoing independent audits, and conducting formal impact assessments. By the end, you'll know exactly how to assess whether your own organization or your clients might fall into this heightened category and what to do about it before regulators make that determination for you. Let's get into it. Let's start with an analogy I use constantly in training sessions. Think about airport security. A small private airstrip handling a handful of passengers daily doesn't need the same security infrastructure as a major international hub processing tens of thousands of travelers. Scale and risk fundamentally change what's required. DPDP applies that exact same logic to data fiduciaries. Most organizations fall under standard obligations, the ones we've covered extensively so far. But some organizations, because of sheer scale, sensitivity of data handled, or potential impact on citizens, get classified as significant data fiduciaries, facing meaningfully heightened requirements. I remember a rapidly scaling fintech client asking me nervously, "At what point do we officially become significant?" That's actually the wrong first question. The better question is, given our trajectory, should we start building these heightened capabilities now regardless of official designation timing? Think of it like a growing company anticipating it'll eventually need SOC 2 certification for enterprise clients. Smart organizations don't wait for a customer to demand it, they build toward it proactively. This chapter will help you think about significant fiduciary status the same way as a genuine strategic consideration, not just a regulatory label to react to once assigned. So, what exactly qualifies an organization as significant under this act? In broad terms, it's a data fiduciary whose processing activities carry heightened risk, based on factors like the volume and sensitivity of personal data handled and the potential impact that processing could have on India's sovereignty, electoral integrity, or public order. Think about why this category exists at all. A social media platform with hundreds of millions of Indian users processes data at a scale where even small systemic failures could affect enormous numbers of people simultaneously, very different from a niche B2B software tool serving a few thousand enterprise clients. I discussed this distinction with a client running a large-scale health app, and their leadership initially assumed significant fiduciary status only applied to massive tech conglomerates, Google, Meta, that scale of operation. That's a common misconception. Health data's inherent sensitivity means even moderately sized platforms handling it can realistically face this designation. Here's an analogy worth holding on to. Think of significant fiduciary status like a hospital's ICU compared to its general outpatient department. Both provide genuine medical care, but the ICU handles higher risk situations, demanding more intensive oversight, more specialized staff, and considerably more rigorous protocols throughout. So here's a question worth asking honestly about your own organization. Given the volume and sensitivity of data you handle, not just your company's overall size, could you realistically face this heightened classification? That honest assessment shapes everything else in this chapter. Let's get more specific about how this actual classification happens. The government considers several concrete factors: the volume of personal data processed, the sensitivity of that data, the risk to individual rights, potential impact on electoral democracy and state security, and the risk of harm to data principles if that data were compromised. Think about how these factors interact rather than operating in isolation. A relatively small platform handling extremely sensitive data, say a niche mental health app with just 50,000 users, might still warrant significant classification because of data sensitivity alone, even without massive volume. I worked with a genetic testing startup, technically quite small in overall user numbers, but handling deeply sensitive biological data with serious implications if compromised. Their compliance team initially assumed their modest size exempted them entirely from heightened scrutiny. We had to reset that assumption considerably once we mapped their risk profile against these actual criteria. Here's an analogy that clarifies this well. Think of classification criteria like assessing flood risk for insurance purposes. It's not purely about a property's size. A small house directly on a floodplain carries higher risk than a much larger house on elevated, stable ground. Multiple factors combine to determine genuine risk level. So, here's a practical exercise worth running. Rather than just asking, how big are we, map your organization honestly against each of these specific criteria individually: volume, sensitivity, potential harm, and systemic impact. That granular assessment reveals your realistic classification risk far more accurately than overall company size ever could. Here's an important detail worth understanding clearly. Significant fiduciary status isn't self-declared, it's formally assigned through government notification. The central government identifies and notifies specific organizations or categories of organizations as significant data fiduciaries based on the criteria we just discussed. Think about why this formal process matters practically. Without official notification, organizations might either overestimate their obligations, building expensive, unnecessary infrastructure, or underestimate them, remaining dangerously unprepared until formally notified. This process creates genuine clarity, even though that clarity sometimes arrives with limited advance warning. I discussed this notification uncertainty with a client's leadership team who found the lack of predictable timeline genuinely frustrating. How do we plan budget and hiring if we don't know exactly when this notification might arrive? My honest guidance was, don't wait for certainty, build toward likely designation proactively if your risk profile strongly suggests it's coming. Here's an analogy worth considering. Think of this like a company anticipating eventual stock exchange listing requirements. Smart organizations don't wait for the exact listing date to start building proper governance and financial reporting infrastructure. They build it well in advance, knowing the requirement is realistically approaching. So here's the practical takeaway for organizations in this uncertain zone. Rather than treating government notification as an unpredictable event you simply react to, treat your own risk assessment as the genuine trigger for building heightened capabilities well before any formal notification actually arrives. Alright, so let's say the notification lands. The first obligation under Section 10 is this. You must appoint a data protection officer based in India who represents the significant data fiduciary under the Act. Now read those words carefully because each one is doing work, based in India. Not a regional DPO sitting in Singapore who covers APAC, not a group DPO in London, in India. That's a hard requirement, and I've watched multinationals discover it late and scramble. The DPO reports to the board of directors or the equivalent governing body, and the DPO is the point of contact for the grievance redressal mechanism. So this isn't an advisory role tucked inside legal, it's an accountable, board-facing, named individual. Let me tell you about a client that got this wrong in spirit while getting it right on paper. They appointed their head of IT security as DPO. Nice person, well qualified. But think about it. When the business wanted to launch a new data-hungry product, who assessed the privacy risk? The same person whose bonus depended on shipping it. That's not independence. That's a conflict wearing a title. So here's my question to you. If your DPO had to tell the CEO no, could they? Would they still have a job the following quarter? Because that's the real test of whether you have a DPO or just a nameplate. Think about who in your organization could genuinely hold that line. So the second obligation, a significant data fiduciary must appoint an independent data auditor to carry out data audits, and that auditor evaluates compliance with the Act. Let's focus on one word, independent, because that's where I see the most creative interpretation. Here's what independent doesn't mean. It doesn't mean your internal audit team who report to the same CFO as everyone else. It doesn't mean the consultant who designed your compliance program last year, now checking their own homework. And it definitely doesn't mean the vendor who sold you the privacy tool, auditing whether the tool works. Let me tell you a story. I was brought in to review a client's audit report. Glowing, 94% compliant. Then I asked who did it. Turned out it was the same firm that had built their consent management platform 8 months earlier. So they'd audited their own implementation and found it excellent. Shocking, I know. Here's the analogy I use. Would you accept a school report card written by the student? Of course not. Not because the student is dishonest, but because nobody can see their own blind spots. That's the whole point of independence. It's not about integrity, it's about perspective. So think about this practically. When your audit report lands on the board's table, the first question a director should ask isn't, what's the score? It's, who wrote this and what's their relationship with what they audited? If you can't answer that cleanly, the score means nothing. So the third obligation, and this is the one I find most genuinely useful, the Data Protection Impact Assessment. Section 10 describes it as a process comprising a description of the rights of data principals and the purpose of processing, assessment, and management of the risk to the rights of data principals and other prescribed matters. So notice what's at the center of it, not your risk, their rights. That's a subtle but enormous shift. Most risk assessments in organizations ask what could hurt us, fines, reputation, downtime. A DPIA asks, what could this do to the person whose data this is? Completely different question, completely different answers. Let me give you a real example. A client was building a hiring algorithm that screened CVs. Their security risk assessment was flawless, encryption, access control, everything green. Then we ran a DPIA and asked one question. What happens to a candidate who's wrongly filtered out? They never find out. They never get to correct it, they just never hear back. That risk had been invisible to every other assessment because it wasn't a risk to the company at all. And here's the timing point that matters most. A DPIA done after launch is an autopsy. Done before, it's a design review. The whole value is that you can still change something. So ask yourself, in your organization, at what point does privacy get consulted on a new product? If the answer is just before go live, you're doing autopsies. So beyond the DPO, the audit, and the DPIA, Section 10 has one more clause that I think is quietly the most demanding of all, and it's easy to skim past. The Act says the significant data fiduciary must undertake such other measures as may be prescribed, and it specifically mentions periodic DPIAs, periodic audits, and observance of due diligence to verify that algorithmic software used for hosting, display, uploading, modification, broadcasting, or processing of personal data is not likely to pose a risk to the rights of data principals. Now read that phrase again. Algorithmic software, due diligence, not likely to pose a risk. That's an AI governance obligation sitting inside a data protection law, and most people miss it entirely. Let me make this real. Imagine you're a lending platform using a credit scoring model. That model is algorithmic software processing personal data. Section 10 says you owe due diligence on whether it poses a risk to the rights of the people it scores. Can you explain how it decides? Can you show it isn't producing systematically worse outcomes for a particular group? If you can't answer that, the obligation is already unmet. And notice the word periodic. DPIAs and audits aren't a one-time project, they recur, which means budget, calendar, and ownership every single year. So here's my question. Do you actually know every algorithm in your business that touches personal data? Most organizations don't have that list. That list is where this obligation starts. So let's pull this chapter together. Here's the core idea. Being a significant data fiduciary isn't a category you calculate. It's a designation you receive based on 6 factors that stretch from individual rights all the way to national security and electoral democracy. And because it can arrive as a class notification in the Gazette, nobody is going to tap you on the shoulder first. And then there's the second layer, a DPO based in India reporting to the board, genuinely able to say no. An auditor who is actually independent, not marking their own homework. Impact assessments that ask what happens to the person, not just what happens to the company. Due diligence on the algorithms making decisions about people, and all of it periodic, not once. But here's what I really want you to walk away with. Look back at that list and ask honestly, which of these would you not want anyway? A senior person accountable for privacy. An honest external check. Thinking about harm before you launch. Knowing what your algorithms do. None of that is regulatory overhead. That's just a well-run organization. The notification only decides whether it's optional. Now, if you'd like a structured course on this, with role plays, quizzes, and practice tests, our Udemy course link is in the description below. Do subscribe to the channel so the next one finds you, and the YouTube playlist link is in the description too. Click it and you'll get the full list of every video in this playlist in sequence. I'll see you in Chapter 10, where we turn to governance.